Welcome to the CEN show, the voice of the world community. On Monday, Professor Ra taught on Kwanzaa, and it was a very good show. And I'm going to show everybody how you can access that. So here's the video on YouTube. It was a very good show, very good information about Kwanzaa. And then also here's the podcast on the website, Community Education Network. You go to podcasts and it's the last show on there that we did. So that's an audio. And it's real good information about Kwanzaa. It is a celebration. And I encourage everybody to check those shows out so you can get that information. I also want to encourage everybody to check out the Carl Nelson show when they get time. I was listening to Professor James Smalls on 2 different occasions. If you just put Carl Nelson show in your search engine, and it'll come up the archives for Carl Nelson show, and he has many great guests, but I really encourage everybody to check out Professor James Smalls. He had 2 shows on here late. Okay. I would like to introduce myself. I am Rasaki Maskani. I'm your host this evening. And I would like to introduce the panel. We have Professor Amin Ra. We got Sister Linda Shorter. We got Brother Mashinda. And tonight's guest is Dr. Charles Alexander. He's a licensed clinical psychologist. And I'm going to interview this evening. I'm going to interview him. I just have a few questions for him. Normally when we do this, I like to get about at least 6 or 7 questions in, but I rarely do. So I only came up with 3 questions so we can get the panel involved. So I met Brother Charles, Dr. Charles Alexander, about a month ago on our show with Brother Kwabena. He's an associate of Brother Kwabena's, and I immediately said I need to get this brother on the show after he introduced himself. So I'm glad he came out this evening to enlighten us with his great information. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to ask the brother how he's doing this evening. How you doing, Brother Dr. Charles Alexander?
I am fine, brother, and thank you again for the invite. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Okay, when I was reading your bio, you have a very extensive background, educationally and professionally. And you currently provide the following services: psychological assessments, project management, program development and implementation, individual and group therapy, and strategic planning. Can you please give us an overview of these services?
Sure. So it's been my goal to be able to service the community, and so and to service the age range, and so or the life cycle, and so through a range of different service offerings, I'm able to do just that. And so again, so I provide individual therapy, group therapy, marital, family therapies. I do program development and implementation, quality assurance, and clinical consultations. And I have office-based practice, and also have contracts with the Chicago public school system, where we provide coaching to the counselors and the teachers. And we're also negotiating, well, we've just negotiated a coaching contract with another suburban school as well, similar, to go in and coach social workers and teachers, help the teachers out with classroom management and things of that nature. And so between those range of services, again, therapy, coaching, project management, testing, we're able to touch, the life cycle. So we have children as young as 5 that we're responsible for, all the way to seniors who are needing, diagnostic assessments to assess for the effects of aging and things of that nature. And then just purely diagnostic testing anywhere on the continuum in between.
Okay, so you mentioned classroom management. I think that's a very important piece, and I want to talk to you offline about that.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. Okay. So why do you address the clinical needs of the traditionally underserved populations?
Exactly for that. Because, just by definition, we need those services. We need those services in place. And by and large, that the underserviced, that underserved population is impacted by 2 things. Usually, well, if there's a disparity, even with the Affordable Care Act, there still remains a disparity in the Black community with regard to insurance, and then adequate insurance. And depending on the quality of insurance, or even just the access to insurance, that will dictate what types of services that people can access and where they can access those services. And so, knowing that, we have to be very intentional about where we show up so that we can meet some of those needs. And again, like even part of the strategy in going into the school systems, we're able to access funding from the schools that means that kids, and in some situation parents, can get services for fee-for-services that are supplemented by the schools that don't require insurance or don't require private insurance. And one of the things that I was struck by, and this was back in 2001, Surgeon General David Satcher did a groundbreaking study on kind of the demographics of mental health. And but one of the things that he found that was very profound in his research is that at that point, the majority of Black folks who were seeking services were presenting in emergency rooms for services. And so that is not an optimal way for anyone to obtain mental health services, because it's not going to be any service, or it's not going to be any therapy. It's going to be an assessment to kind of determine whether or not that person needs to be admitted or not, whether or not that person is, to what degree that person is a harm to him or herself or the community. That's really what that service is for. And then if for some reason they determine that that person needs ongoing service or ongoing care, they do try to make some referrals for those folks, but they probably don't have services there for them. And so at best, people can go in and get emergency screenings, and they might be prescribed medication. And in those circumstances in which they are provided medication, they probably are not provided any kind of follow-up. And so we have a lot of circumstances in which our people fall through the cracks and and they don't get the adequate care. They don't get the adequate service. And so it really requires that we be very intentional in terms of our mental health delivery services and our efforts to build capacity so that there are multiple spaces in which the community can seek and access care.
That's really excellent that you providing these services for the underserved, because, man, we have I've worked at a high school, and we have a lot of children that need some help. And I do the best I can, but I'm not a professional in that area. But that's excellent.
We have children, we have adults. I mean, it's across the lifespan. And I was looking at some numbers. I think the number is like 50% of 50% of both youth and adolescents and adults who have a diagnosed mental illness don't receive care. And so that's like 50% of Black folks who have a diagnosis don't receive ongoing care. And so again, A, we have to understand that the situation is that dire. And then B, we have to be willing to go into the community and find ways to meet the need.
Okay. That's good. That's excellent. Okay, so now I noticed you had another name that you go by. I want you to briefly tell us about your name and pronounce it for us, and then after that, you have this article out, or is it a paper article? It's the origin of Black historical trauma, and I didn't get a chance to read it all, but I read about half of it. Very interesting. So I would like for you to talk about those two things.
Okay. So my dissertation is on rites of passage. I came to Chicago to attend the Illinois School of Professional Psychology to study with who would become my mentor, Dr. Samila Abdullah. And I came to Chicago knowing that I wanted to write about rites of passage. And so she plugged me in with a brother named Qua John Ziegler. And John Ziegler had already been through an adult's rites of passage. And he and his partner, Brother Lewis, were implementing a rites of passage program at Harper High School, which is one of the high schools on the south side of Chicago. And he says to me, he says, you know, if you're going to write about rites of passage, have you been through a rites of passage? And I said, well, he said, you know, I pledged when I was in college, so I have some idea of the concept. He said, but have you been through an African rites of passage? I said, no, I haven't. He said, so if you're going to write about this thing, you need to go through that. And so what has existed in Chicago since about 1992 or 93 is the International Institute of Rites of Passage. And in 95, I was able to be a part of one of the age groups to go through the rites, one of the adults age groups. And within that, and that rites of passage program was established by Dr. Nana Anthony Mensah, who was a brother from Ghana, and he was a member of the Akan. And so our rites of passage program is kind of predicated on the Akan traditions, but it incorporates a lot of different, use a lot of different, aspects of the various clans all over the continent, but it's fundamentally Akan. But so within the context of that, there are three things that determine who you are, within the context of the Akan framework. And the first thing is the day that you're born, your day name. And so my day name is Kofi. So on Friday, September the 29th, 1967, I was born. And so I came into this world on a Friday, and that means I am a Kofi. And that means I'm an innovator. I'm an agent of change. Okay. And the next thing that determines, who you are is what do the people say, and what do the people call you. And so my parents named me Charles Larson Alexander. Charles means man or manly. Larson means worthy of praise, and Alexander means defender of men. And in '96, we took a trip, the N2, we took a trip to Ghana, and we were visiting with Dr. Nana Mensah, in Ghana, in Accra, and he gave me the name Achere. And Achere means, it means guiding force and guiding light. And he told me that I would be someone that, people would gravitate toward. I would be someone that people would listen to. I could give wise counsel and, impact people, institutions, and so forth. And so I am Kofi Achere. And that gets to the third piece of establishing your identity is given the day that you're born and given what the people say, how do you shape your myth? Do you live in that name? Do you walk in that space? And so as a psychologist, I would say I am living that destiny. I am an agent of change. I seek to be that agent of change, and I seek to engage our people in whatever way necessary in order to, again, kind of build capacity and meet the needs of the people as we meet them, as we find them, as we understand them. And so that's who Kofi Achere is.
Oh, that's beautiful. And you fit right in line with what we got going on here. Okay, that's beautiful. Thanks for that. Now, talk about this paper, man.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another thing. So it's another institution, longstanding institution in Chicago called the Communiversity. And through the years, the Communiversity has consisted of, Baba J. Carruthers, Anderson Thompson, Brother Worrell, Bobby Wright, Kobe Kambone, and my teacher, R. Olamenji O'Connor. And here lately, he has been leading a resurgence in the work of the Communiversity, which essentially is a think tank. And he wanted to do he is doing an edited book on culture and trauma. And he asked that I contribute to that book. And trauma is a space that I work in pretty intentionally and pretty deeply. And through my engagement with the people, with the community, wherever I find us, one of the things that I've often had to contemplate, and one of the things that I continue to contemplate is, when I come in contact with people and they say, our culture or my history, it didn't start with slavery. And then I ask them, so, okay, well, tell me something about your life or your culture or your history prior to slavery. And, most people can't. And so as I continue to, contemplate and ponder that, one of the things that I kind of knew intuitively, and one of the things that, I also knew because I love to read. I have just a voracious appetite for reading, that our trauma started before the transatlantic slave trade. And so when I was asked to contribute to this edited book, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write about what was going on the continent that, precipitated really the transatlantic slave trade. And so what I sent to you, brother, was the article that's going to go into this edited book, but this article is probably going to be the introduction or perhaps the first chapter or what have you for probably what's going to become a book in and of itself. My plan is to starting with this information that we're going to get into, and then bring it to the transatlantic slave trade, bring it to our experience in this thing we call the United States, and go from 1619 current with the continuous assaults on our character, on our person, that has has left us traumatized. And so, in short, just to get to this article, what I posit, and this is predicated on the research, long long in place by Dr. Diop, Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, Chancellor Williams, and borrowed pretty heavily from Dr. Ben and Chancellor Williams. And to start with Dr. Ben, his take is that the onslaught and the destruction of Africa started with the Hyksos invasion of Egypt. And so that's 1667 or something like that BC. And then from that point forward, you then have after the Hyksos, you then have the Assyrians, then you have the Persians, then the Macedonians, then the Romans, and then the Arabs. And because of that constant pressure, we're pushed from Kemet back into Nubia, into Ethiopia, and then into the Sudan, and then further across and to the West Coast. And through that time, we had the rise and fall of several kingdoms. And so within that, we have contact. Well, what's precipitating that again is the contact with these folks, from Europe and Western Asia and Arabia. And because we have this contact, let's start with when we get into the Sudan and we get into like the ancient empire of Ghana, and you have contact with the Arabs. There's a decision made by leadership during that time that it's in the best interest of the empire or whatever to go into business, to do business with the Arabs. And so this starts off as just a business decision, and at a point it's determined that it might be advantageous for the people to start to practice Islam in the interest of trade. And so they start this trade, and the trade goes from probably goods and precious metals and things of that nature to trades and people. Now, prior to the slave trade, prior to the transatlantic slave trade, there was an indigenous system in which there was personal servitude. Now, in the indigenous system on the continent, typically folks who would end up in this system were folks who were they were either criminals, or they were people who were impoverished otherwise and sold themselves into this status, or they might have been prisoners of war, or they might even have had some debts to the community that they needed to pay. And so that's how people could find themselves in this position. And so that was one difference between that and what ultimately became the transatlantic slave trade. And then the other is that there was no form of this system on the continent that I am aware of from any of the studies that I've done in which that position was that's a lifelong designation, and that it was the same caste that followed the child. That any child born to the mother was necessarily a servant. It was not that type of piece. And even for those folks who found themselves in that situation, there are many times where those folks ultimately either were may have returned to, wherever they came from, or, became members of the communities or the spaces in which they were doing their service. And so initially when the rulers start to engage in this bartering with the Arabs, again, it's under kind of the dictates that we're selling goods. Then it gets involved. Then we get involved with the trading of bodies, and at some point, the Arabs are not, they're not satisfied with the terms, and so they start violating whatever the treaties are. And now they're engaging in raids and things of that nature, and they're also encouraging, different people in the empires to engage in the same thing. And so you see this happen with several different empires. So Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And so we move again. We start in Egypt, we get forced back to Nubia and Sudan, and then we have those successive empires, and each of those empires has some contact with the Arabs, and so it is in the context of that we start to see the demise of of the African structure of community, right? Because one of the so what we see on the front end of this, some of the terms that we hear now, and this is one of the things that I start to address in the document, like so we talk about the trauma of forced migration now, right? So we talk about forced migration that's going on in let's look at South and Central America. So we have people who are coming and seeking asylum in the United States, and folks who are coming seeking asylum are by definition fleeing some type of political circumstance that has been determined not to be in their best interests. Okay, so that's considered forced migration. Well, I don't think we really consider what has gone on historically on the continent as that, and that's part of what I'm trying to draw people's attention to. And so, so one of the first traumas that we see is what occurs when we are forced out of Kemet and back into Nubia and into the Sudan. That's a forced migration. So there are certain set of things that occur as a result of that. Then, again, once we start to have these relationships, these ongoing relationships with the Arabs, we then make some decisions in terms of, our social and our religious order. We decide that we are going to start to practice Islam in the interest of commerce. Okay. So that's another trauma, right? We not only do we have this trade that goes into the theft of primarily women and children, and that's one of the primary differences between the Arab slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, is that the Arab slave trade was longer, and it probably took more people, but the Arab slave trade, it took primarily women and children, and most of the men who were involved became servants to the trade, and they were castrated and they were made to do the bidding of the Arabs. And so all of that is traumatic. And again, but just the disruption of, of a Ghanaian way of life of a way of life in Mali, of a way of life in Songhai. All of that is just necessarily it's disruptive and it's traumatic. And so we have this going on again from 1600 BC all the way to 600s, and that's where this document goes. This document is going to go really just into that space, like 1600. I might take it to it's really kind of that to the point at which we end up on the West Coast. And again, the conversation is about the amount of trauma that is occurring, over that, about 800 years, 1,000 years of pressure from the Arabs and other folks in Western Asia and the Mediterranean. And then ultimately, when I start to write again, I'm going to start to talk about the pressure from Europe and the Asiento. And so the Asiento is the contract that was drawn up by the Catholic Church, in which they brokered a deal with Spain and Portugal to go and populate, Central and South America and the Caribbean, and to also barter and steal Africans from the West Coast in order to do just that. And so all of those things are going on, and whatever is necessary for that to go on, those things, all of that is going on before, before 1619 or whenever it is that the first slave ship lands here. We have the Portuguese and the Spaniards, probably on the west coast of Africa. I'm thinking probably like 1300s or the 1400s. So there was much groundwork that they were doing in order to kind of set this up prior to that eventual transatlantic slave trade. And so that's really what I'm dealing with in this article, is that all of the years of trauma that occurred as a result of our contact with, again, Arabs, Western Asia, Mediterranean, and then ultimately Europe. And in each of those cases, not only did it result in forced migration and slavery, it also resulted in the loss of culture and our spiritual continuity.
Yes, very interesting. Now, is this a working document? You're not concluded with it yet?
This document is a draft of this document is already to the editor going into this book. But like I said, so it's kind of both. So this is going to appear as one of the chapters in the edited book, but it's going to be a standalone, just with regard to historical trauma.
That's excellent. We want to make sure we get a copy of that book. That's for sure. Very good information. Okay, I'm going to go to the panel. Sister Linda, questions, comments?
No, I don't really have a question because it's so interesting and I'm writing all these notes. And of course I have to absorb it. But I want to ask just one quick question. It's another direction. You're talking about the historical trauma. And today's trauma with children in foster care. Have you ever even had an opportunity to look into that?
Yes,
Direct.
and so in that space, we're talking about complex trauma, right?
Yes.
And so in my effort, again, to service the lifespan, I actually consult with the state of Illinois, and I spend a great deal of my time in foster, working in the foster care system. I've been contracting with the state of Illinois for 15 years, specifically to address that. And for the state, I monitor outpatient psychiatric care for the youth in care, and to some degree to the biological parents. I do that statewide, and also am responsible for psychological testing statewide for all youth in care who require testing during inpatient psychiatric admissions. And so I spend a lot of time consulting with case managers and other service providers about the impact of trauma, and how the various presentations of trauma get confused with other mental health diagnoses. So, for example, this desire to diagnose kids, and then this is an issue also in the school systems, this desire to diagnose kids with ADHD. And so it's okay, well, they can't pay attention. Well, a child who's traumatized probably cannot pay attention because their system is reading and perceiving threat and danger. And so they're orienting to the threat and danger. So it's not that child can't pay attention. The child is not paying attention in class because the child is probably paying attention to the threat and danger. And so having these types of conversations all the time and helping people to kind of understand what it is that they're seeing, or having them understand, dissociation, which is also another common, aspect of trauma. And so the child isn't daydreaming, the child is dissociating. And that's again, you have these breaks from reality because these are adaptive functions that the body does in order to try to keep the mind and body whole, trying to help a person, help a little person in particular, in this case, have some sense of safety. And so, but most people don't understand it that way. And so, they think, they daydreaming or ADHD or any of these other diagnoses, but not really understanding what the impact of trauma is and how trauma itself dysregulates the system, so that our flight system, which is really designed to be an adaptive system to keep us safe, can sometimes betray us.
Okay. Linda, anything else?
Oh, no, that was it. I
Okay.
just want to, because I've heard, and when I worked in the school system, a lot of the children were in foster care, they always recommended Ritalin and those kind of medications.
Yes.
And
so
I was the only person that was always saying you should not do that.
Mm-hmm. You are correct. And I was actually, I had this conversation the other day, and this actually, this wasn't even with the youth in care. This was actually, but this is how this conversation usually goes. So I was having a conversation with two parents who are divorced, talking about their son, and so they both said, well, we think he has ADHD, but we don't want him on any medicine. I said, okay, I'm fine if you don't want him on any medicine. I said, but why do you think he has ADHD? And they said, well, he can't pay attention, and he can't pay attention because he's struggling with the effects of the divorce. I said, well, that's not ADHD. And they both were like, well, no, that is ADHD because he can't pay attention. I said, no, that's anxiety. Now, he certainly could have ADHD, but the reason, if he's distracted by your divorce, that's not ADHD. That's as anxiety, and that anxiety certainly could be exacerbating ADHD if he also meets the criteria for ADHD. But if you tell me that that is the reason why he's not paying attention, that's not attention deficit disorder. And so, so a lot of the work that we have to do, period, this is period. We got to do this work in the community. We have to do this work in the schools, and we have to do this work definitely for youth and care. Youth and care are youth who are involved in child welfare. We really have to do, health literacy work to help people understand, have a language for the mental and emotional and the physical experiences that they're having in response to trauma, and B, understand how and where to seek service, and see, kind of what those range of services are. And, but this is a problem kind of across the board that we have to try to meet. But, our children are the most vulnerable. And, again, that's a part of why I spend time in the spaces that I do. I try to be in spaces where I'm able to provide a measure of assistance and comfort to our most vulnerable populations. And so those tend to be our children, and those tend to be folks who comprise the folks who are public aid, or just uninsured or Medicare. Those groups are the most vulnerable in terms of what's going on in the communities that they live in, what types of resources are available in those communities, and their relative access to care in response to those things.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Linda. Excellent question.
And
I
thank you.
could see where the parents are thinking one thing, and you're able to educate them about, they're being misunderstood. They don't understand what's really going on. So it's good that you're able to kind of, educate them, because the ignorance leads to more issues. So that's excellent. All right, Brother Mashinda.
Good evening, Dr. Alexander. Thank you
Yes,
for
sir.
your presence tonight. Very interesting. I appreciate your work, what I've heard thus far. Just, just kind of piggybacking off of Miss Linda Shorter, as far as, the medication, she mentioned Ritalin, and there's a brother, Dr. Umar Johnson, out there. I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Mm-hmm.
Not, and of course, I'm an open-minded individual. You hear different sides of, naysayers and negative and positive about brother, but this is not my comment. My comment is, I listen to, and it's not just him. It's, I've been working in the systems and working in the education and criminal justice for many years, and so. What is your take on it? Do you think there's an abuse of, in terms of medication? Is there abuse to our children as far as misdiagnosis or lack of diagnosis or that type of thing? Don't care, just yeah, he's crazy or he's violent or he's this, he's that. Put him on medication. What's your take on that? And briefly.
All those things you just said. And so all of that stuff is happening. And, so it's always my goal to try to slow the processes down. Actually I was just reading an article, see if I could pull it up while we're on here, just talking about the number of people, period, who are misdiagnosed, while in the hospital, and this is across ages and race and ethnicity, the whole nine. This is just the number of people who are misdiagnosed every year. And so we know this happens, and that it's so we're very vulnerable once again, because if we are getting service, we're probably not getting service. Like, we're probably more likely to be serviced by a student, a resident or something like that. So just like we look at the school systems, our kids are disproportionately more likely to be taught by a first-year teacher, or a teacher that's somewhere between their first and third year, and they're probably working off of their bachelor's. They haven't gone back to school to get their master's yet, and so we get very, very green people into the classrooms teaching our kids, and it's that same thing in mental health. And so if we are able to access care, we are probably being treated by, the least experienced folks. And with regard to, I think, both psychology and psychiatry, Black folks make up less than 2% of all licensed psychologists and psychiatrists. And so, and it's not much different for licensed social workers or professional licensed counselors or counseling psychologists. I mean, there just is not enough of us to meet the demand. And so we are particularly vulnerable. And because people don't always know what they're looking at, and because in addition to the misunderstandings and the misdiagnoses that come as a function of people not understanding the impact or the presentation of trauma, you then also have the impact of white supremacy. So, so if you have service providers who are at best, just regular self-absorbed racists versus the ardent white supremacists, because they contrary to popular belief, exist in the ivory halls and exist in the hospitals and the medical centers as well. When you have those people who have that level of disdain and disinterest in the people that are in front of them, then the people are necessarily vulnerable. And so all of this stuff happens. And so that's why, so one of my goals all the time, again, I'm pushing health literacy, and I'm pushing health literacy to the community, and I'm pushing health literacy and competency to service providers, so that we can help people out. And so that's treatment and diagnosis, period. And so now when we get to this issue of medication, I am neither absolutely for or against. So I also have a credential in pharmacology. I have a master's in pharmacology. And so, there are circumstances in which the medications can be helpful. But, all of these medications have some level of toxicity. And so we have to be mindful of that. B, the medications in and of themselves, the medications don't do anything in terms of skill building. And so there are far too many people who agree to medications, and some people are even coerced into the medications, thinking that the medication is going to change what is probably a behavioral issue. The medication helps with neurotransmitters. The medication doesn't help with behaviors, and it doesn't help necessarily with thoughts, but it can have some impact on thoughts. But all of these things are going on, but these are things that people need to know. But we have to slow the processes down and make sure that parents have the best information possible so that they can make informed decisions with regard to the best interests of their children. What I know happens a lot of times is that schools are telling parents, because again, I do testing, and schools are telling parents, go get your child tested for ADHD Well, the school don't know that the child has ADHD. So the question really should just be, go get the child tested, because we have some concerns about his or her ability to pay attention, right? And so then you let the test circumstance dictate what that diagnosis is, But in those same types of situations, you have schools telling parents that that kid can't come back to school until he or she is diagnosed and has medication. Well, to get their kid, to get that child back into school, the parent now has some, motivation to get this test and this diagnosis and that medication. Right. Now they don't know that, they're not intending to do harm to their son or daughter, but that harm could necessarily occur because in the grand scheme of things, when it is brought to the parent in that manner, it's really a violation of both the parent and the child's rights. And so the school is acting, as a bad actor in that situation. And so we have to slow those processes. And again, we have to slow those processes wherever we find them. We have to slow those processes. And if there is a community mental health center, we got to make sure that the people in the community mental health center are culturally competent and they are, ethical and they're clinically sound, and that they are given the information necessary so that our parents can make good, sound, and informed decisions on their behalf, on their children's behalf, as well as on their own, or on, for the benefit of themselves if necessary.
Okay.
Can I please add one small thing to that? Let's not forget the parents, because they get a check, and it's sad to say, and
so we have that too.
Absolutely, just get that check.
Yeah, we have that too. And so, and another thing that we have in child welfare, so you have levels of care in child welfare, and so you certainly have situations in which you have foster parents, sometimes intentionally and sometimes because they actually don't understand what they're looking at, making all types of assertions about children in the hopes that they could get a higher level of care, which will ultimately result in a higher board payment, right? So, so if this is a traditional foster home, they get a certain rate to host children, and then if they can get a higher designation, a designation of a higher level of care, which in the state of Illinois we call that specialized care, and I'm not sure, what they call it in other states, but that higher designation means more money, and so there are these relative financial incentives for biological parents who are seeking checks for social security benefits, and for in some circumstances foster parents who are seeking boost in their board rate because they could get the child specialized. And so and again, that's kind of in the state of Illinois, that's where I come in. And so I have some relative ability to route children for psychiatric evaluations to places that I feel are safe, for the evaluations to occur. And then we have some things in place to make sure that medication isn't starting, that medication is not the first line treatment, that, there has been other interventions involved, and this is primarily for children for 5 and under, that we make sure that there have been other interventions attempted before medication occurs, and then we see if we can help the child out. And so we have, we actually have a protocol for that. But when I send my children to, so like we have 4 continuity of care centers, when I send children to the continuity of care center, whether that child, however old that child is, that child anywhere from 0 to 18, that's who can get service in the continuity of care center. I know when they go to the continuity of care center, regardless of their age, that that medication is not going to be the frontline service. They're going to try to meet the child's needs through some structural interventions in the placement and through the work that they do in therapy to see if they can, make the necessary adjustments so that medication won't be necessary. And then if medication is necessary, it's just necessarily, they then start at the lowest dose and they will, increase or titrate up as necessary, but using, kind of field, generally accepted kind of algorithms to determine what would be the amount appropriate for this child. And so, but the unfortunate thing with the prescribing of medication is that in most cases, and this is across the board, doesn't really matter who the child is that the doctors, most medications, most psychotropic medications, and those are the mind-altering, the intentionally mind-altering medications. So those are medications that are prescribed for psychosis, mood disturbance, and the whole nine. Those most of those medications are prescribed by primary care physicians. Okay, and so primary care physicians aren't trained to prescribe psychotropic medications. So that's a problem. But I kind of know how it happens and why it happens. And then B, neither primary care physicians or psychiatrists have a really in-depth means for diagnosis. So a lot of times diagnosis is based on, when we're talking about kids, diagnosis can be based on, the parent's observations or just, whatever the parent narrative about the kid is otherwise. And, in the prescribing professionals, a lot of times they take that and they utilize that. And, they may talk to the young person too, but they weigh heavily on the adult's perception of what's going on. And they then prescribe free of any, any like objective data or any statistical data that might be provided as a result of actually testing that youth to find out if there are actual statistically significant levels of cognitive impairment or emotional impairment or something of that nature. And so this thing gets very, very tricky. And but again, this is another aspect of health literacy. We just have to make sure that people understand and know what it is that they're seeing, what it is that they're hearing. We have to make sure that everybody, not just children, but everybody in the lifespan, we have to make sure that people have the language necessary to explain what it is that they are experiencing. One of the things that's very common for me, in some of the work that I do and some of the conversations that I'm having, I ask a person, so how are you feeling? Well, such and such did this and such did that, and I feel a certain kind of way. So that's a mental health, that's a mental health statement for some people. I feel a certain kind of way, right? We need for people to be able to say, I'm mad, sad, angry, indifferent, whatever it is. We got to help people understand that feeling a certain kind of way, he on one, he tweaking, those aren't mental health diagnoses. I mean, not diagnoses, but symptoms. And so when you say those things, it's no telling what kind of help you're going to get in response. And so we need to have people understand, or have the language for what it is that they're experiencing. And then we also need to have people understand where you get help. And so, what's the difference between going to a psychologist and a psychiatrist? Okay, so a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. A psychologist either has a PhD or, in my case, a PsyD. A PhD is a doctorate in philosophy with an emphasis in psychology. A PsyD is a doctorate in clinical psychology. So we have to have people understand those things so they know where to go to get whatever the services are that they need. If I just need therapy, do I need to talk to a psychiatrist, a PsyD, or can I talk to the social worker? Well, you could talk to the social worker. And so, if, and you could talk to a counselor also. So you can talk to a counselor, you can talk to a social worker, and you could probably talk to a psychologist. And then there are some psychiatrists who actually do therapy, but not many. And so we have people languishing, though, on the wait list for those psychiatrists who do therapy, when there is a social worker who could have seen them, but they don't understand because they think that's where they got to go. And so we have to make sure that people understand how and where to access service. We have to make sure that people understand and have the language to describe whatever their symptoms are. And we have to make sure that people have access.
That's heavy. Yeah, it's pretty deep. And then, yes, wow. Okay, Professor Rob.
Oh, wow. This is nice travel. First of all, appreciate what's been said, if I understand correctly. What is the definition of trauma?
So trauma is really not a very complex definition. I mean, trauma is any event that causes impairment in your thinking, your feeling, or your behavior. I mean, that's just it in a nutshell.
Right.
And go ahead.
What is the prognosis?
Kind of depends on what the trauma is and who the person who's experiencing the trauma. The people who are most vulnerable to trauma are people who were already vulnerable before the trauma. So people who were already exposed to less than optimal living conditions, if something traumatic happens, they are more likely to be traumatized. And their ability to rebound from the trauma, again, kind of depending on what the trauma is then attached to their ability to identify or be identified and then have access to competent care. And so if they can receive that, it's a pretty good chance. Again, we got to be mindful of whatever it is that happened and kind of whatever else is going on in the people's lives. But there's this concept called plasticity. And so the brain will adapt and can adapt. And so there are many things that through the course of just consistent services, people can regain their cognitive abilities, their emotional abilities, and be able to function in a productive manner. But it really just kind of comes down to access to care, and that is still even greatly impacted by whatever was going on with that person prior to the trauma.
Do coping skills help a person if he develops their own coping skills to deal with the various categories?
That's a great question, brother. And because, one of the things that people don't understand is that the trauma response is really the body's built-in coping mechanisms. And so the issues, kind of arises, again, it's kind of like what was going on before and, during and then after, as to whether or not those innate skills that your body is just going to do because that's how we're built. Our autonomic nervous system, which is comprised of our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight piece that helps us to orient toward danger and either fight or flee. And if we cannot avoid that danger, if we cannot escape that danger, in some circumstances, it might be more appropriate to freeze. And so that's an adaptive process. But once dysregulation occurs, people can get stuck in either one of those phases. They can get stuck and freeze, they can get stuck in flight, or they can get stuck in fight. And so one of the things that happens is that we have a lot of pathologizing of the body's natural response to threat, when in reality, what we're looking at are adaptive mechanisms that our bodies do. And so that's one piece. Now back to the broader issue of coping skills. Yes, for many people, the issue is, can we teach them, can we teach them the range of skills necessary for them to be able to respond to their environment and whatever the environmental stressors are? Can we teach them the skills necessary, and if we're talking again specifically about traumatized people, can we teach them the skills necessary, those skills of discernment, so that they can appropriately distinguish between, real threats versus those things that simply remind them of the previous trauma, right? So can we help them to regulate and to be calm and thoughtful, and be able to make the decisions necessary to keep themselves safe and not overreact, or in situations where it does require that they get out of that piece, are they able to move, or are they frozen by the circumstance?
Okay, let me go back to Machinda. I don't think he finished his questions. And then I'll just conclude with 2 questions. Go ahead, Machinda.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, he has his hand up. Did you have some more questions?
Well, not really. I was just, listening to what he was saying.
You
In terms of,
you had your hand up. That's what.
I don't know if I put a hand up or not.
Okay. Well, let me
Anyway, go ahead and finish.
Okay. The other thing is that when it comes to, we've had some great. First of all, it's not that many Black psychologists. I mean, so, it's not that many Black doctors in any field, and so, and sometimes we have Dr. Amos Wilson. I know you're familiar with his work. I like to believe. He said we are unique, but is there such a thing as one psychologist once said, Naim Akbar, when he said break the chains of the mental chain, psychological slavery. Yes, slavery in the community itself. He argued that it's abnormal for Black people not to have trauma and stress in a racist dynamic. What role do you think? Because you went into the history of going all the way back, and sometimes the terms have changed. Very few historians would say slave trade. They would say the Holocaust of enslavement. Second, they would call it human trafficking, not slave trade, no matter who was doing it. Even if you catch a brother misusing a young girl, taking her around, pimping her, that's human trafficking. In its nature as well.
And that's what it's referred to in my article. Yep.
Yeah. And the same thing with regards to going all the way back. Then there was a lot of people that said that a lot of the imposition of Christianity and under the auspices of Christianity, I'm not saying they were Christians doing it, they claimed they were. Muslims who claimed they were really used violence on the continent. Because I think Chancellor Williams talked about miscegenation, they mixed, of course, and then they began to use war and things of this nature. So my question is that under the auspices of oppression, if there is a term, oppression psychoneurosis, and today's Black youth or Black people who are having mental breakdowns that are reflective in homelessness, indiscriminate violence, the abuse of themselves and others. Do you treat that psychological problem as a symptom of trauma, or caused by trauma, or just caused by just a mental breakdown or emotional breakdown, or just I don't know. I mean, from your standpoint, because courts sometimes require people to go, people plead insanity. I mean, what is the degree of measurement that you would gauge in?
And I also appreciate that last piece that you said. I think one of the things that we all have to understand is that it's insanity. That's a court term. That's a legal term, right? People think that that's a mental health term, and it's not. That's a legal term, and it really has nothing to do with mental health necessarily. It is about a person's ability to discern right from wrong. So appreciate that statement, Baba. And then, but to your question, this is really kind of gets to the core of why I wrote the article and where I want to go with the concept, and that for us, and I agree with Naim Akbar, it would be, and this is kind of the purview from which I practice, it would be an indication that something is wrong if we are not having a psychological response to global white supremacy. This is what our system is designed to do. It is designed to identify and orient towards the threat. And so you start to see a range of behaviors that are occurring in response to the oppressive conditions that we live in. And so there are certainly some other factors that are included in that, which will, some more proximal factors than the actual supremacists that will, greatly influence, how it is played out. And so, one of the fundamental things that exists or occurs as a result of this thing. So you mentioned Naim Akbar. I like to also expose people to the thoughts of Kobe Cambone, who espouses that the most fundamental form of mental illness for Black folks is psychological misorientation. And that's what comes with human trafficking. And that's what I'm talking about in the article. I'm talking about how our fundamental sense of self has been stolen and disrupted, right? And we see this over centuries, over hundreds, thousands of years. And so we get to this space, we're looking at complex trauma. We're looking at the compounded impacts, of this historical trauma. Every year, every day, every moment, every day of every week, of every month, of every year, there is something happening to us somewhere, either individually or collectively. And those things add up, right? And our point of reference has been skewed by the aggressor. And so we start to do things that either mirror the aggressor. Well, a lot of what we do mirrors the aggressor, and to the degree that the aggressor typically does not have boots on the ground, other than in the form of a paramilitary force that we call the police, we act out on those people who are closest to us. And so all of these things are a function of that historical trauma that then become complex traumas that we experience on a day-to-day.
I got it. Okay. Well, this has been great, man. And you know, because I like I said, dealing with the mental, you know, like what Linda question was, you know, you have a large percentage of Black people living with not just in foster care, but with not with their biological parents.
Mhm.
And some of them do it just for the money. And then, you know, they say that's one of the highest amount of homelessness is Black people 18.
Yes.
Because, so, you know, that right there, facing 18, you 17, 18, and you ain't got yourself together, but people saying you're going to have to leave here because I got to get another kid, you know.
Yeah. And so we have, you know, to your point, so we have a significant number of children who, you know, so if they're in college, if they're enrolled in college, they can continue, you know, they can stay in care until they're like 21 or 23. If they don't go to college, then they age out the system at 18. And, you know, if return home wasn't an option for them for whatever reason, um, you know, a lot of those youth, you know, a significant number of those youth end up homeless. Even youth who prior to aging out, even those youth who were in like transitional living placements, we call those TLPs, and those are um, um, uh, you know, their living circumstances, you know, probably apartment living. Youth have, um, you know, they have freedom. You know, they work in the community, they go to school in the community, and they live in an apartment setting with other
Mm-hmm.
youth. And there's probably an adult on the premises, but you know, all of the youth have their own, you know, their own rooms and apartments and things of that nature. The goal of those programs, and also we have programs called independent living programs where youth are actually in apartments that are just in the community. The goal of those programs is that, you know, from the time that youth is placed there to the time that youth is 18 and or graduates from college, that they're learning the independent living skills that will allow them to function in the community and be a productive member of the community and be able to act on, you know, on their own best, you know, on their own behalf you know, in a manner that's going to keep them safe, excuse me, and in their best interest. But again, that is as good as the service provider. And so if we don't have good service providers, and if the service providers, like some of the foster parents, are just kind of in this for the money, then, you know, we have a lot of those kids that go into those programs and they come out of those programs the same ill-equipped and ill-prepared as they were when they went in. And so they then end up a part of the homeless population.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hey, man, deep. We'd like that. I'd like to get some more with you, so I'll be communicating with you.
I'll be back whenever
All
y'all
right.
need. I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. Having the
Thank you.
opportunity to be here.
Yes, sir. So, Brother Machinda, did you want to get that question in?
Well, like I say, I was just you know, in the midst of listening to him when I was anyway, um, you know, basically, you know, my experience like working in the criminal industrial complex, as I call it, as it relates to juveniles, you know, some of those many cases that were being adjudicated, you know, kids from the neighborhood who, um, from my point of view and what I was doing in my experience before all of that, you know, what I deem as ridiculous sometimes in terms of outcomes and dispositions of what happens to that child. You know, if you're in the criminal system, you know you're being labeled as a gang member, uh, you know, being labeled as violent. So anyway, in my experience, had to go before the courts, had to present psychiatric or psychological evaluations in many cases, and go before a screening committee, and people that don't look like me who's making decisions, not to say that people that don't look like me can't make a decision. I can't just be all, it's absolute. But I do know that a high percentage, what I saw was kind of a cookie cutter type of response to, in other words, if you're a gang member and you're trying to, and so as far as these enhancements, what these kids get to determine their outcome, where they're going to be placed, whether it be a group home or a lockdown facility, and so forth. So so the ones that was charged with me, I did my best to do outside. I used to, it cost the agency, extra money to get a private or an outside evaluation, and uh, it was a good thing that there was a brother that was in the neighborhood who was a clinical psychologist who did a lot of the evaluations. And so, in other words, trying to make the the outcome or the diagnosis, I guess, in terms of whatever the psychological or psychiatric evaluation was trying to prove or disprove, it was easy for them to say, oh, well, this person's violent. Let's send him. We're going to give him, 3 years in California Youth Authority, something like that. Whereas I know personally, not only this kid is not hardcore, and of course I did many social studies where I have to learn the family environment and things like that, and based on my research. So in other words, if I didn't go outside of the government agencies, psychologists that they had working there, so a lot of our kids are caught up in this system, and it repeats itself over and over again. So I stayed in it as long as I could to try to help as many. But a lot of things changed. Became more pro law enforcement, got away from more of the therapeutic, and then of course overall they're saying now they're getting rid of a lot of the lockdown facilities, and it's a lot of other things going on. But that's after my time. But during my time, I'm just saying they were sending them through the mill, and so I had a hand in trying to make sense out of each child that came through there. So that's why I appreciate your efforts, is because what I'm hearing is that you're a voice, you're a mind, you're an expert, or you're a conscious authority on what you're doing to try to help an individual, because it's not a one size fit all cookie cutter situation, which what I witnessed, and there was people that looked like you and I who were just allowing that to go on, but not on my watch. So I appreciate you, brother, and I'm gonna leave it at that. And I was going to ask you about dyslexia. Learning different learning styles in the classroom. Kid might have dyslexia or something else going on, and they say, oh, we're gonna throw him in special ed. When they have schools of dyslexia that actually train them with their learning style, and they go to college and be very successful, and that kind of thing. So I just threw some stuff out there, man. So your response?
And thank you, Baba Mashinda. To that first part that you were talking about. So I do. So the state of Illinois, I think the state of Illinois contracts with about 20 psychologists. So I'm one of 20 psychologists. And again, I'm responsible for statewide outpatient psychiatric services for youth and care and some parents, and I'm responsible statewide for psychological testing for youth who are currently in inpatient facilities. And then I also do, I think it's about 5 of us that do what's called secure care assessments. And this kind of speaks to what you're talking about, Bob, in which, we're getting youth in care from the juvenile detention calendar. And so we're having, like, some of these youth are actually in correctional facilities and we go in and we interview them and we write clinical reports and make recommendations about again, the level of care or what type of facility or placement that they would most likely succeed in, um, which could range from, a secure or locked clinical facility, or a regular, traditional residential placement, a group home, or could they actually step down to a foster placement or return home? Now, they almost never can go from the correctional, from the detention to a foster placement, but they can go from, they could go from the correctional or the Department of Corrections to a residential or a group home and then to foster placement. But we have an opportunity in those spaces to advocate, for children, and even in circumstances in which, their behaviors and their relationships and ties make it necessary for us to, in order to keep the youth safe and other people safe, there are just necessarily times where we have to make a recommendation that that youth go to a locked clinical facility. And so our decision is not to put that child, like we don't get to weigh in on whether or not that child goes to another detention center or to any kind of actual carceral spot, but we do get to make a decision when necessary that if that child needs to reside in a locked clinical facility, because that is the only place where he or she could be maintained long enough for the effects of therapy and treatment to ultimately, kind of settle in. We do that, and we seek to do that, in the most ethical and an effective manner. And so that, that we do, and that I do, and I like doing it. And I also think that is a part of my responsibility to be able to utilize my skills in a manner that allows me to advocate most for, again, the most vulnerable. And so that's that part of your question. Now, so like the special education piece, this is another thing where we really have to make sure that our parents and our families have the adequate health literacy. And so health literacy doesn't, it's not just about knowing the name of words, knowing words and definitions. It is also about having a full understanding of, the services available. And so, if a child has, dyslexia or some other type of specific reading or learning disability, if it's a concern that that is occurring, the parent has to make a request in writing to the school district to have a case study evaluation conducted, and then if it is determined that that child meets the criteria for that, then the school is required to meet his or her educational needs. And they do that through an individual education plan. And so a lot of times parents don't want that individual education plan because they think it's, they only really think it's a labeling piece. But in reality, to the degree that we can make sure that this is done, in a ethical manner and with efficacy, it's, if the child meets the criteria, it is in the best interest of that child to have that individual education plan for reasons that Brother mentioned, is that if that child keeps that plan, and for as long as that plan is necessary and valid, that child could use that plan to go on to college and get the necessary accommodations to have success in college as well. And so the whole point of it, again, is to make sure that whatever the identified disability is not the reason why that child is not able to successfully complete high school or college. It is the responsibility of the educational facility, once made aware that this youth has an individual education plan, to put the services in place necessary to bridge the gap between the effects of the disability and what's necessary for that child to have success otherwise.
Excellent
Yeah.
information.
My experience with schools, a lot of school systems in particular, you know, the ones I've dealt with, they don't, you know, I mean, some of them at a bare minimum, they will, you know, they have to, like you say, they by law, they have to acknowledge the IEP, the accommodations and things like that. But what I'm finding is too, and it's depending on where you're at, but a lot of schools, they, you know, the teachers don't find time to really deal with that. You know, they
Yeah.
do it, of course. I mean, it really is a gross negligence that's going on. You know, I know firsthand, and
So
you know,
that,
I work with ADA. You know, I'm a contact person where I work at a college. And so you're right with that IEP. We take that IEP and use it from high school and things like that. But what I'm finding is, if you know, a lot of people. I guess the bottom line is people aren't as aggressive as I would like them to be based on what I know. And you know, I'm not like I say, we can be negative all day. There are people that are different levels of know-how, and they sometimes they do the best they can within the resources they got. I understand that, but at the end of the day, a lot of kids fall through the cracks because although it may, a lot of it goes unidentified because you know you may have parents that don't understand that they don't, you know, like you say, they, you know, I know that like where I work at, they have to bring it to our attention that they need accommodations. I can't go out and solicit. However, you know, it's like, wait a minute. Some, you know, when you know there's a problem, it's like you almost want to solicit. Like, hey, anybody got any problems? Can you read? Can do you write your D's backwards? You know, that kind of thing. But you know, like I said, we don't do that. But it's almost like I don't know, at a K through 12, it's like kids, and I work K through 12, where it's kids are just lumped into a basket sometimes, where hey, you're special ed, and like you say, kids might, or you know, then they get 504 or whatever. But the point is, it's like a lot of the teachers is they're not even equipped to deal with it. Now, if you say, hey, they can read aloud, you know, these accommodations, sure, they can do that. But I find that a lot of, you know, there's a lot of educators out there that feel, you know, like I'm left-handed, so I'm in a right-handed world. It's like you just get used to opening that door that way, you know, and hey, this is the way it is. And you know, I just find it unfair. But like I said, I appreciate you for all you do, man. I could talk all day. I'm off the air.
thank you again, brother. And but you make another great point. And again, this is, I mean, I just cannot overemphasize this issue of health literacy. And you know, so the other thing with the IEP is as good as not just the educators, it is as good as the parent. The parent still has to do some work once that child gets that individual education plan to make sure that the youth is getting the related services or the accommodations as dictated by the plan. And so I had a conversation with a parent just this past week where, you know, the son he has a learning disability, and part of it is his reading. I don't think his reading is at grade level, and so he's failing driver's ed. And so I was like, well, why are you failing driver's ed? And he's like, well, I don't like the classroom work. And I was like, well, are you getting the accommodations? How are they presenting the work? And he don't know if he getting accommodations or not. And then the mom was like, well, I might need to check. But yeah, sister, you always got to know. Whatever classroom he's in, you have to figure out, you have to ask the questions about the degree to which his IEP, you know, applies to this particular instructional level or you know, or form, you know, or medium or what have you. And so, but we have to make sure that parents understand that. Now, that being said, we also have to understand that school was traumatic for some of our parents. So some of our parents are school, you know, so you know, so we had this thing called school phobia, right? So where you have kids who don't want to go to school, they're avoiding school for whatever reason. We have parents like that, right? So sometimes the parents are not available, you know, are not able to help their children. They're not available or able to help their children in some of these circumstances because they have their own residual traumas from their own academic circumstances. So we have to be mindful of that as well. And so, we have to, really kind of bridge the gap, or at least kind of get these things out, like when we're seeing this, because a lot of times those things kind of accrue in a negative manner to the child, So if a parent is supposed to come to the school for this, that, or the other, and, they're like, this parent never comes. Well, maybe the parent don't come because they work 3 jobs, right? Maybe the parent doesn't come because you don't have a nice school, and the only reason that their kid is here because you're the kid in the district, and the parent is not comfortable coming up here, or maybe it is just simply because the parent has a historical history, their recollection, their memories of high school, or school period, their recollection of school period is traumatic. And so they have an avoided kind of attachment to the school setting, but they send their child, but they don't feel, comfortable or competent enough to go there and advocate, for their child. Well, that parent needs advocacy too, right? So we have to, when we find those situations, we got to advocate for the parent and for the child, but we got to find them. We got to look for those opportunities to do good and help the people.
Excellent, excellent. I just wanted to share just what you're talking about, that how the parents negatively transfer their vibe to their children. I have on the website, I have perspective writings, and here's one of them that speaks about just what you're talking about. And it's called Positive Math Perspective, the Elimination of Negativity. The parents can transfer that negativity to the students. And one of the examples is, I don't like math, I never was good in math. And then the child is constantly hearing this, and they take on this personality. So that was very interesting. So yeah, on the website, we have numerous perspective writings that address some of the issues that's being discussed this evening. So that's excellent. Excellent. So definitely, Dr. Charles, we want to get you back on here, and I'm pretty sure Professor Ra want to get you on Conscious Corner. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we definitely want to get you back on here. It's very in-depth information and very useful, especially with the parents thinking that, it's one diagnosis and you have to clarify, no, that's not it. It's just excellent information. So I really appreciate you coming on here, and we definitely want to have you back.
And again, brother, I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to coming back again. And Baba Amin-Ra, I found my Dr. King books. I found and I found The African Origin of Biological Psychiatry. Yes, sir. Right. So, hey, listen. And I got Naeem Akbar up on the shelf too, and Amos Wilson. I got it all. This is my people.
And you mentioned what's the African brother name? Black Psychology, his book.
Kobe Kambon.
Kobe, yeah. I
got him up there too. And,
you had found the article. You had mentioned the article in your first presentation of misdiagnosis in hospitals.
Yes.
Would you send that to Rashiki?
Yes, I will.
So he can send it to us? Because we have a lot of people that deal with homeopathic treatment, and they're always pointing out bad doctors and bad medicine. We need that. All right then, brother. Rashiki, when's our next meeting? Monday? I mean, we meet tomorrow in the book, but are we going next Monday?
Oh yeah, the only way we won't go is if you tell us we're not doing it next Monday.
No, I want to have a panel discussion on the psychological development of the Black child.
Okay.
And I want you to be on it, as well as Linda probably, and the whole panel discuss it.
Okay, well, if Dr. Charles can stop by on Monday, we'll be here talking about that.
The same site?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Psychological. We're going to do, I'm going to be coming from Amos Wilson and Francis Press Welsing perspective on psychological development of the Black child.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Brother Rashiki, I just sent you that article. The article
Okay.
about the misdiagnosis.
Okay, so next week, folks, on the CEN show, next Wednesday, Brother Thomas is gonna host. So we're gonna have Brother Thomas take over, and he's gonna host next week, and he's gonna talk about a few things. So that'll be good to have Brother Thomas come on. He's one of our team members. So I appreciate everybody this evening and the contribution. And so we're gonna say, like we always say, each one teach one in Conscious Corner. And everybody have a good evening.
All right. You take it easy in Chicago, brother.